Well, I'm back in the hot tub talking to conservative people or progressives who have conservative thoughts and decoding them as an ultra-progressive. Today I'm speaking with a gentleman who's roughly my age. I've known him for quite a while now, and he is strange. He suffers from what many conservatives suffer from in that he is not very articulate. He doesn't have sound reasoning, and he's not compassionate. Now, I see him fairly often, and he tells me his spin on current events. Now, back in the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protest era, he had an awful lot to say. And it's hard to describe exactly how disturbing this was. Him talking in this way made me very uncomfortable, as you can probably imagine. But let's get into it. He likes to talk about current events. And not too long ago, he and I spoke about the George Floyd protests. Now, overwhelmingly, he was talking about Black Lives Matter and the protesters as rioters, and that they were breaking the law, and that the police needed to do something about it. He said it was ruining our downtown areas, and that the aftermath was going to be even worse. What I'm telling you now is sort of a culmination of a multitude of our conversations. So when he saw on the news that certain businesses had been boarded up, or certain downtown areas were seeing a decline in activity and economic growth, he immediately turned to the George Floyd protesters and said they're to blame. This was interesting to me because at no point did he bring up the pandemic. At no point did he draw the connection between the fact that there was a worldwide pandemic and a downturn in economic activity. This was Antifa. This was Black Lives Matter. This was protesters. He called them rioters. This is what destroyed the downtown in his city. It wasn't the downturn that stemmed from a worldwide pandemic. It was these people, this group. In the wake of the pandemic, we've seen an increase in homelessness and open drug use. This too, according to him, was the George Floyd protesters. He blamed those protesters for what he saw occurring years later. I paused for a moment and I said this to him. I said, so you don't think that a lot of this has to do with the pandemic? A lot of this has to do with governments shutting down drug facilities and throwing homeless people out into the streets instead of helping them and housing them? This doesn't have to do with taking funds away from the homeless and from our drug programs and putting them into other things? He just scoffed at this and said, the real estate in those areas has plummeted, and the only way to fix it is to go in there and smash some heads. That's what he said, smash some heads. He wanted to see police engaging with homeless people, with Antifa, with Black Lives Matter protesters in a violent way. He was actually calling for more violence. Now, he was calling for violence during the protests. He was calling for violence after the protests. He was calling for violence against now the homeless encampments, and he's calling for violence against the drug use in the open markets and so on. He's blaming the protesters and the rioters for the downturn in economic activity and the increase of homelessness and drug use, and he thinks that that's why the real estate market has collapsed in these areas, and he also thinks that the only way to fix this is through police brutality and violence against U.S. citizens. And he calls for this openly. He says this kind of stuff as if I'm going to agree with him, or as if he's making a point, as if the only way to handle protesters is through violence, and the only way to handle open drug use is through violence, and the only way to handle homelessness is through violence, and that violence needs to be perpetrated by the police. This is insanely conservative. It's a conservative notion to think that violence is the answer to our problem, that we have human suffering, we have economic suffering, we have other kinds of suffering, and that suffering can be alleviated by inflicting more suffering. It's conservative to think that we should eliminate those that we don't like, or those that cause economic turmoil. It's conservative to find an enemy and pin the woes of society onto that enemy and then call for the extermination of that enemy. Now, the science demonstrates without any doubt that violence does not solve these problems. Police brutality does not solve homelessness. It doesn't solve drug abuse. It certainly doesn't raise real estate prices, and it doesn't stop protesters. It doesn't solve social and public outcry against the government, or in the case of George Floyd, police murdering citizens. The science demonstrates that we need social programs to actually solve these problems. Homelessness can be solved by giving people homes. Drug use can be solved solved through psychological programs and support. And protesters and social outcries like Antifa and Black Lives Matters, those can be solved through better public services provided by the police and other organizations. George Floyd didn't need to be murdered by police. Even if he had committed a crime, and the crime he was charged with was buying goods with counterfeit money, that's not any reason to kill anybody. At the very most, he should have been talked to, perhaps arrested, but honestly, it's hard to find the actual crime there. The most that should have happened to George Floyd is that he should have been peacefully arrested and brought into the station under charges of counterfeit, and then let our system of law, either demonstrate that he's guilty or conclude that he's not guilty. But only a conservative or somebody who's suffering from conservative thoughts and beliefs could watch the George Floyd murder and think, that's what we need more of, more police brutality. Now, I've known this guy for a long time, and it's difficult for me to even talk to him because of these views. And ultimately, I don't really talk to him anymore. I think I've heard enough. But as a progressive, as somebody who understands a lot of the science behind how we solve these social problems, the science is very clear and demonstrates that violence has largely become obsolete. And that's something that everybody needs to start to understand and apply when they think of a solution to their problems. Violence in all of its forms, whether we're talking about warring country against country, whether we're talking about hitting children or women or beating up each other, or whether we're talking about, or whether we're trying to change people's behavior, violence is incredibly ineffective, whereas teamwork, cooperation, support, and ultimately providing people with their needs, our core needs, our physiological needs, basic human needs, food, shelter, water. This goes much further to curtail violence and to curtail protests than does, as this conservative psychopath states, smash some heads. And it's important to recognize how readily and easily conservative thought calls for violence to solve problems. These are the same people that think that we need more prisons, we need to put more people in prison, and so on. And I'm going to discuss that a little more in another episode. Now, in response to this, I mentioned, well, wouldn't it be better that instead of going in and, let's say, beating up all the homeless people, wouldn't it be better to support them with psychologists and psychiatrists and housing? Wouldn't our time be better spent trying to nurture and work with them, trying to support them and get them to a place where they can be happy and healthy, and then by proxy, we can be happy and healthy because they won't be out in the streets having psychotic episodes and so on. They'll be under our care, and then we can go out into the streets and be safe. And what he said was so conservative in its mindset and so inhumane that it just makes me cringe every time I think of it. He kind of looked at me queerly and was like, well, I guess we could do that. As if the compassionate, empathetic, and sympathetic conclusion that I drew through all the evidence we have in science, psychology, psychiatry, everything else, as if all the evidence we have from science that demonstrates that support and nurturing and working with these people in a team environment solves the problem of homelessness and drug use as it pertains to society, as if that is a fool's errand. He said, I guess, like he's never even considered anything other than violence. Like he's never even thought of, well, maybe we could actually help them. And this is also very conservative. A conservative sees a social protest like Black Lives Matter, like the protests for George Floyd's murder, and sees disarray and lawlessness. Even though they would say, out of one side of their mouth, they would say, well, you have a right to free speech. On the other side of their mouth, they'd say, yeah, but do your protesting over in your little corner over there and get out of the way so that we can get to and from where we want to go. Don't inconvenience me with your right to protest and free speech. So it's very hypocritical just in and of itself. But a conservative looks at people marching for their rights and to not be murdered by police and thinks we need to commit violence against those people. This is social unrest and it should be squashed out with brute force, with an iron fist. And we see this all across the world. All economies, all countries, all governments that have conservative members and have a conservative presence talk about violence against groups of people. Not how do we study them, support them, use the information that we get to solve their problems? How do we exterminate this? How do we show them through force that they're not going to succeed and it's not even worth protesting? Now, again, I've known this person for a long time. I've heard a lot of these views from him, and while a lot of the times he just sort of spins his wheels, like I said, he's not very articulate. He suffers from this conservative problem of inarticulate language. Most of what he would say up until, about 2020 was pretty benign. It wasn't until he started expressing this urge and insistence on violence as a way to solve our problems that I really started to question whether or not I should even be talking to this person. And as a progressive, while I certainly pushed up against him and challenged his beliefs, as a progressive, I also understand that the more people you have in your life that think this way, the more likely you are to empathize with them and to sort of meet them halfway. It's a progressive mistake to think that, oh, this will never happen because it's too outlandish, it's too inhumane. And that's a mistake most progressives make most of the time. Liberals and progressives are constantly underestimating the danger that they're in by the regressive right and alt-right and fascists and conservative thinkers. It's true that conservatives really do want to do physical harm to you, and they're the ones with the militias, and they're the ones with the guns, and they're the ones with intent to hurt and intent to cause suffering. They think that's how the world should work. And it's a mistake from progressives to just sort of say, I don't think that'll ever happen. And I think it's also a mistake to maintain friendships with folks like this, because you will, as somebody who cares about humanity, start to empathize with them. You'll start to sort of move over to their side, even just a little bit, even if it's just to downplay the severity of who they are. They call for the murder of protesters or the violence against protesters, but he's not really that bad of a guy because blah, 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 blah. How many pro-fascism, pro-violence people do you really want in your life? After having this conversation, I had to start asking myself that question. And as it turns out, I don't want very many in my life at all. The bare minimum. This has been Hot Tub Monologues. Thank you for listening.